Okay, I wanted to go over some of the pointers and tips on this project. So this was the changing of the oil filter housing on the Wrangler, and the one I got was the Dorman kit, and the Dorman kit comes with pretty much everything you need. This is the original old housing, the plastic one, and this is the original old oil cooler. So the kit that I got from Dorman actually came with the cooler and also came with an aluminum oil filter housing, which the cooler mounts on top of that. But I want to offer some tips and pointers before, if you're thinking of doing this yourself, and a lot of people do because the Wranglers, they're pretty notorious to leak within the housing seal area. So if you're going to do this yourself, it's definitely something you can do. And I would recommend that you go on YouTube or online and watch some videos of other people who have done this. There's a lot of really good mechanics out there, like full-time mechanics out there that will show you exactly how to do this. So don't look at don't use my video as a step-by-step. Rather, use it as a pointer to things that can help you along the way. But you want to find someone who has a really good step-by-step. Kind of just a video only. I like those where they show every single bolt coming off and what tools they use. So I'm not going to do that here, but I will show you the pointers and my advice so you can kind of prepare yourself and get set up for it. First thing you're going to want to do, okay? The Wrangler, when you work on a Wrangler, if this is your first time, this is kind of what you're up against, right? So obviously you have to climb up in here on the bumper and you have to get up in the engine and you're kind of standing on your head. Somebody else used that terminology online, and you're standing on your head and you're using your hands to kind of like almost do a handstand on the motor area, and it's absolutely one of the most challenging positions you'll be in while working on either a truck or a Jeep like this. Trucks are a lot like that too. The good thing about the trucks is that there's usually enough room within the engine compartment where you can get in there and sit down. Believe it or not, and then you're kind of sitting in the engine compartment. You can't do this on the Wrangler. It's just too tight. So what you want to do is get yourself a little ladder, 4-foot ladder I've got here. So I use this, I'll climb up here, I'll get up onto the bumper, step right up and step down. You're gonna go up and down, and I'm not lying, like over 100 times when you're doing this project. So get your ladder set up so you can get onto your bumper so you can step onto your onto the Jeep in the engine area. So, and also get some soft rags, because when you're up here, your knees have to go somewhere, right? Because you're going to get up here and you're going to be into the engine, and you're going to want to kneel. You want to kneel on this area of the Jeep. You don't want to kneel on the fender because you'll crack all that and you'll probably break it. You don't want to kneel on anything soft like the electrical boxes or the washer fluids or the brake area or any of that. You want to always put your knees on the frame, right? And so you're going to put down some rags. So that's my first pointer. Get your ladder set up, or staging. If you've got staging for painting, that is a great way to go approach this. I think next time if I have to do this kind of work again on the top of the motor of the Wrangler, I will set up my staging, and you can probably roll it right over the Wrangler, right over the brush bar up against it more, and you could lay down on it and get in there. I just use ladder. So the first pointer is ladder. The second thing you want to do is get yourself a pick. This pick is going to be your lifesaver for all the connectors you're going to have to undo. All the fuel injector connectors, all the connectors for the coil packs, they're super brittle. And they've been in there, almost 10 years on this Jeep, and they've been through heat. And if you don't pull and push them just the right way, you're going to snap all your connectors, and that's not really going to be good, because you'll have to zip tie some stuff together and make up some connectors. So get yourself a nice pick or a flathead angled screwdriver. The 90 is critical. You're gonna put that against the connector where the little notch is. You're just gonna lift up on it. Don't use your fingers on it. Just go from the inside of the connector, pull up gently the way it's supposed to be. They'll all pop right off. Literally, you pull up the right way and they slide right off. So do yourself a huge favor and get a pick just like that, or a 90, some kind of screwdriver. You can bend it on a 90 to get it in there. This is a hydraulic seal pick, the 90. Get one of those. That'll take off all your connectors. You won't break one connector. And believe me, when you break the connectors, you can't just buy a new connector and splice it into the wires very easily. It's kind of a pain, so you don't want to break them. The other pointer I'm going to give you is I reused both my sensors. I believe one's an oil sensor and one's a temperature sensor. I don't know which one's which, but the upper one, the upper sensor, it would not come out. And I ended up putting a pretty good size impact socket on there and then using my impact trying to get that out. Obviously, best way to get fittings or sensors out of brass is not to use an impact because you'll probably damage the sensor. But so I went ahead and tried a wrench on there, a socket, couldn't get it. I got the bottom one out, no problem, came right out. The top one, not so much, right? So only way that I could get this out is if I cut it out of the plastic housing. So this sleeve right here, this is what the sensor it screws into, and this is mounted, mounted into the housing. So this is supposed to grip the sensor and not spin. When I was taking it off, this whole thing was spinning in the housing, the plastic housing. So obviously I had a sensor that was kind of seized into this brass fitting. So I cut, you can take a little side disc grinder, and I cut the housing right here on one side and right here. Notice I took a screwdriver and just kind of shattered the housing. You know, I'm not gonna reuse this, this is old. And then I was able to get the whole thing out with the sensor still in it. I took the vise then on the sensor, and I just used a pair of channel lock pliers to back off the fitting, right? So this is a fitting that, you know, you're not gonna need, but so that was the third pointer I can give you. If you're gonna reuse your sensors, this one could be a problem. You can cut the plastic with a little sanding disc on a drill, and then use a flathead screwdriver to pop that and break that apart, let the fitting come out with the sensor in it, put it in a vise and spin off the fitting. You should be able to reuse the sensor. I've actually started the Jeep, let it run for a while. Sensors are just fine. So a couple things you may want to do is just get new sensors, both the oil and the temperature sensor. Just get new ones, right? And that way you don't have to do any of this. You're just going to leave the sensors in the existing housing and throw it away. But if you don't want to, you can do this if that becomes an issue. The other thing I want to point out is I can show you where this failed, and I think it's relatively a common issue. This side of the housing, you see that crack right there where it's shattered open? So when I pulled this off, you can see in there, this was shattered, and the O-ring that was supposed to be in here was smushed through here. So somebody had taken this off and put it back on, and when they did that, they torqued it down so much that it shattered, or this just shattered and cracked over time, right? Either one. But honestly, this whole thing, all the O-rings were smooshed or either cracked or gone, and this was shattered. So obviously there was major leakage going on for a while, and this is a pretty common thing on the Wranglers, and that's why people are changing them, moving to the aluminum, the metal housing versus the plastic. So that was all I wanted to give. If you're gonna tackle this, you definitely can do it. I'm gonna say time-wise, I had a couple fabrications I had to do. This one here, I had to kind of get this out. I also had to fabricate. I had to drill out a hole from a broken stud on the lower manifold in the back. That was kind of a long time because it was a tight fit. I spent about 2 hours on the fabrication stuff, but honestly, if you want to give this a time, this is about an 8-hour job, 6 to 8 hour job. So for me, I like to work in about 4-hour increments. So for me, it was a 2-day job because I work only 4 hours a day. But you could do this in one day. It would be about 6 to 8 hours. If you got to fabricate some stuff like I did with the sensors and the broken bolt, add that time on. So you may be in the 10-hour range. So for me, 2 5-hour days or 2 4-hour days, that's what it took. You could definitely do this in an 8 or 10-hour span, the full day. For me, I didn't want to do that because, standing on your head inside the Jeep for 4 or 5 hours is plenty of punishment for one day. So, but you can definitely do this in one day. And, if you have any questions on any of this that I show in my video, just reach out and I can help you with it. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and install the Dorman oil cooler kit for the Wrangler. It's a 2013 Wrangler Sahara. It's got the 3.6 Pentastar in it. And it's showing signs of not only coolant coming off the back of the top of the motor, but also oil on some days. So So one of the problematic areas on the Wrangler with the Pentastar 3.6 is that the oil cooler assembly sits on top of the motor and it's made from plastic. So these motors are great. I don't want to knock the motor. I think a lot of the issues that have come up with these motors over the years really have nothing to do with the motor, but more to do with the componentries that have been used around the motor. So this is one of those things where obviously the plastic materials on these, whether it's the thermostat housing or it's the oil cooler itself or other plastic materials that were used around the motor to actually build the components that are around the motor, those were used, I would say, probably with plastic and should have been used with a metal material like an aluminum or something more durable. I think you'll see on these a lot of issues with thermostats, and I believe it has a lot to do with the coolant that's being used, and perhaps that's also causing issues with the oil coolers as well, because that same coolant is going through the oil cooler and using the oils being cooled through the coolant, which is in the radiator. So the way these work is that you have coolant that circulates through this oil cooler, and then the oil is being cooled by the engine coolant, right? So kind of a simple design, kind of makes sense why they would do it that way. What probably wasn't the best decision was to use plastic. And I think, again, the issues with the plastics that are used on these Pentastars has a lot to do with this coolant that's being used. It's biodegradable, it's environment friendly. However, it's not so friendly with the plastics and the rubbers and the seals and all that stuff that are being used on the motor itself, right, around the motor. So again, Pentastar, great motor. The oil cooler, plastic material, not so great, obviously. So today I'm gonna go ahead and swap out the old one. It's showing signs of leakage from oil perspective and also coolant. And I have the Dorman kit, which I love so far. It gives you everything you need, and you get all the bolts and you get all the seals, you get the new oil filter itself. When you do this to the 2013, you have to keep in mind that you want to use a 2014 and newer oil filter going forward, and they tell you all that within the kit, but that's something that for future owners or for future oil changes, if you forget, will be an issue. So they give you a sticker which is supposed to put on the oil filter cap, and that way there's no issues. So I'm going to do that today. I've also got the upper hose on the this is for the coolant flow from the manifold or the oil cooler itself back to the heater core. So this is one of the hoses that is hard to get to, and while I'm in there, I'm just going to replace it. That's the Mopar hose there, so I'm not going to go in there afterwards and change that again. So I want to make sure that's right. New clamps and hose, and that's only because while I'm in there, you want to change what you can, because you don't want to have to do this twice. This is all labor, and it's not a lot of money on parts, but there's a lot of labor. So you don't want to have to go back in there and do this twice if there's a leak or anything like that. Okay, so I got the upper manifold is off, and when I took it all apart, it takes about 45 minutes to pull this all apart, and it takes that long because you've got wires and harnesses in there that just don't like to move out of the way. So when you go to get the upper manifold off, just take your time. It's not hard at all. There's probably, I think there's six or seven bolts. There's 6 bolts, and then the 7th bolt on the manifold is tucked underneath the firewall. So you're gonna have to pull pretty much everything off the top of the manifold. There's a little foam protector that's got to come out, and then once you pull out that foam protector in the back next to the firewall, you can see that 7th bolt. You pull that out, and then the whole thing will loosen right up. I pulled out some of the bracketry on the right side is in there to hold the manifold in place on the right side. You can pull some of it out, do what you have to get it out. Once you wiggle it a few times, it'll come right out. I always put something in there so I don't drop a socket in there or a nut in there. If you drop something in there, that's going to go right into the valves. So you can definitely get it out. It's not really a big deal, but it'll be a pain. So I always put some shop towels just folded up inside there. I'm going to pull that lower manifold off anyways, but for now, while I'm working on the plugs, I've already got the plugs out. I put the coils back in place just to keep the holes covered so there's no plugs in there on the driver's side. And the good news is that there's no issues with the head gasket. It's just the plugs, they probably have about 70 or 80,000 miles on them. So when you look at the plugs, which are over here, they look all about the same coloration wise, and the electrodes are all normal. There's carbon on them, which is normal, and you can see the age of the plugs. They look like they've got at least, if I had to guess, I would say these have at least 70 or 80,000 miles on them. These are the iridium style plugs. So the gap on these it looks way too large as well. If you see the electrode, how worn down it is, that's really worn. So you've got a huge gap on the electrode. And honestly, it's just time for plugs on this. And I think once I change the plugs on it, I will put it all back together. I'll run it for another 1,000 miles and see if the light issue goes away, the misfire on cylinder 6. I'm fairly confident that's all it is. And if it isn't, and if I still get a misfire on 6, the next thing I would probably do is look at the coil itself. I would move that coil from 6 to 4, cylinder 4, and then repeat the 1,000-mile test and see if I get a cylinder 4 misfire versus a cylinder 6, and I know it's the coil. You can absolutely test the coil on these. They're not hard to test, but the problem is the tests aren't always enough. You have to really run the coil to see if it's going to work properly, especially under the load or under hot, extreme temperature conditions and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is put this back together, put new plugs in it once I'm done with the oil cooler, and then I'll run it for 1,000 miles, and I'll see if that the error code with the misfire in cylinder 6 goes away. I'm thinking it probably will. So that's that step. I'm going to now move on to pulling the lower manifold, intake manifold off so I can get to the oil cooler. Okay, I got the lower intake manifold off, and it was relatively straightforward. There's some clips on the injectors that if you spray things down, what I use is WD-40 on all my connectors. So as soon as you hit it with some WD-40 and you spray them down, really no issue, right? You're just gonna be gentle with all these connectors and all these wires. The wires in the connectors will be brittle from just the heat and the age. So if you take your time, you can get all your connectors off, and you pull the lower intake manifold off, and you can put it right on the ground. It's over there on the ground. And when I got into this, I knew I had a leak of antifreeze and oil from the top of the motor. And sure enough, when I pull this off, I don't know if you can see this or not, but there is a good size, a good amount of antifreeze on the top of the engine and oil. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and clean up all the surfaces in here before I pull the oil cooler out. I'm going to clean all this out, take a shop vacuum and just kind of gently vacuum it out, and then wipe it down with some towels. I went ahead and took my shop towels out of the upper intake and put them into the, these are the intake ports on the heads where the valves are. So I put those right in there, and that way, same idea. I don't want to drop any bolts in there, any kind of debris in there if I don't have to. Not the end of the world, but you definitely want to get all that out before you put this back together. So it's easy just to block this up before you get too much stuff in there. And that's pretty much it. Lower intake is out. I'm gonna vacuum this out like I said. I'm gonna pull the cooler out, and then I'm gonna change out the hose and go from there. Okay, I've got the oil cooler out and on the floor next to the intake manifold. I wanted to show really where the leak was. This is obviously overspill from the block right now. The block is full of coolant, right? So obviously there's pressure in there, and it's kind of overflowing from where it would normally be in the oil cooler area. But even just after I took off the oil cooler, there was really no fluid coming out. It was all over the place in there. So it clearly was leaking for a long time, coolant. And the symptoms I had were, I would lose about half a quart of coolant every other week. So it was losing coolant at a slow rate, but it was just about a half a quart every other week. So that led me to kind of research, well, where would it be going? And there was no drips on the floor, which was strange. So all the coolant that was coming out was actually evaporating off the top of the engine, or rolling off the engine onto the bell housing, and maybe dripping once in a while, maybe just a drop or two. So that was an indication that the coolant was coming from the top of the motor, and it was just enough to do about half a quart every other week, and it was just enough to almost fully evaporate when it did leak. So it was kind of hard to tell where it was coming from. My other concern was that maybe it was burning coolant and there was a head gasket issue. And I also had a error code cylinder 6 misfire. So just coincidental that the plugs needed to be changed. There are about 80,000 miles on the plugs. And I've had a pretty consistent leak in the oil cooler for about 6 months to a year. And that's what it was. It's just the gaskets in the coolant area. Again, gaskets going bad early or drying out, probably due to the coolant. Not sure why the coolant is causing everything to dry out on these, but I suspect it's the same issue. It's the same issue with that coolant. So I'm gonna go ahead and change all this, clean this up first, obviously, and then change all this. Everything is cleaned up. I've got all the sensors on the new oil cooler, and I've got the hose also on there. Everything went really smooth. I think the only tip I could offer is that when you pull the sensors out of the old cooler, they don't really want to come out, especially the top sensor. That one there is probably gonna give you some trouble. I had to cut the there's a housing. The plastic has a brass housing that comes with it. The metal one here is different because it's all metal, but in the plastic one, there's a little housing, a brass housing that goes around the sensor, and that's what the sensor threads into. That housing will probably spin on you in the plastic and becomes something you can't grip, right? So I had to cut the edge of the plastic housing apart and then pull the whole unit out, put it in a vise, and then spin off the housing, and then I could use the sensor over. You can replace these sensors. I would recommend just go ahead and order new sensors when you order the oil cooler. I didn't do that, so I'm gonna go ahead and reuse these sensors, but I do run the risk of the fact that I pulled these sensors out and I reset them in the new cooler. I do run the risk of that I've potentially damaged one or both of the sensors, and I'll have to go back in there and change this out. I don't think that's the case because I was fairly careful, did not get any thread sealant on the sensor itself. So I'm 99% confident that these sensors are just fine. But to do yourself a huge favor and avoid having to go and remove the sensors from the old housing, just order new ones, because you're gonna spin those new ones on. They come pre-threaded with gasket maker or thread sealant, I should say. So you're gonna be good to go. You spin them on and it's 5 minutes. I spent a half an hour trying to get the old ones out, and I had to, then clean them up, and now I got them back in. But that's the only tip I can offer. And also the other tip, I got the new hose, right? This is a brand new hose. I don't want any leaks with coolant, so I figured get the Mopar hose. Comes with the clamps. I got that on there. Everything is back together underneath. I've got the O-rings in there. Got some oil on the O-ring on this one. And these seals are all good to go. No reason to oil those. You just want to oil this guy here because that's going to go inside the block. And it is good. It is really easy to use this kit and put it all together. I went ahead and shop vac out the area of the motor. So shop vac, nothing fancy. Went in there and just ran the shop vac. Got it pretty clean and pretty dry. That residual will dry up on the block when the engine warms. That's not a big deal. But it's all cleaned up. All the surfaces are clean and flat. Nothing left behind. I'm gonna go ahead and install the new oil cooler. And then once I install it, I still have the old hose there. I don't want to disturb the old hose yet, because once I do that, it is gonna let out the coolant massively. So you're gonna have no back pressure. And that hole right there where it's just barely seeping out once every 5-10 minutes is gonna become the spillover point in the block. So keep a vise on that hose, right? That heater hose, that return hose. And I've replaced it, don't forget. So when I put this back on, I bolt it all down, make the connection. I have the hose, I'm gonna quickly swap it out, and it's just gonna leak a little bit. And the actual oil cooler, the new one will be in place, right? So there's no leakage point there. It'll just be into the oil cooler where it belongs. And I put my new hose back on and I'm good to go, right? So that's kind of a trick I can offer, especially because you do want to change that hose Mine's pretty stretched out, pretty worn, and I don't want it to leak, that's for sure, because if it leaks, you're gonna be back in here changing out a hose. I've got the housing installed, and I've got the oil cooler bolted to the top. I wanted to point out, I've been calling this the oil cooler. I know it's not the oil cooler, that's actually the oil filter housing, and what attaches to that is the oil cooler. That's the oil cooler. I've been calling this whole thing the oil cooler assembly. So just be aware, I realize that it's not, right? This is obviously an oil filter housing, which is aluminum, which has the aluminum oil cooler assembly bolted to it. The kit I got, it comes with a new oil cooler aluminum one, which is the same as the one that will be on there. So if you don't have the new cooler, it's not a big deal. You're gonna use your existing one. It looks identical to this. You're gonna mount that to the new oil filter assembly or housing, right? And it all kind of comes together. I'm gonna continue calling it the oil cooler assembly just because it's easier for me. But just be aware, I realize it's not really what it is, right? So I've got it all back in there, and I've got everything bolted down to the torque specs. They give you the torque specs in the kit. Again, the kit is great. If you want to make this easy, go with the kit I went with. It's got the cooler with it, right? So you can use your old one, or you can use the kit that has the new one with it, and I think it costs a little bit more. But for me, I wanted to do this once and kind of be done with it. I've got everything on there, and the next step is going to be to put the lower intake back on. Now the lower intake is going to be, it's kind of a mess when you go to clean this up, I'll be honest with you. The way I did this was I took out the old gaskets, which were here, and I used a seal pick, right? This is the hydraulic seal pick. I used that to pull those old seals out, put the new ones in. First, what I did was I pulled them all out and I cleaned the entire assembly up on the inside. So in the ports here on the intake, there's kind of a trick to getting these clean. This is all normal, right? So when you run gasoline through the intake, it will leave deposits of oil on the walls. That's just normal because any petroleum-based product has oil in it, right? And so after a lot of mileage, you're gonna have a lot of deposits left behind in the walls of the intake. You don't want to leave that there because that's going to get pulled into the valves. Once you run, let's say you run a cleanser through your gasoline. So you put something like this, injector cleaner through it, a bottle of that, Lucas or whatever brand you want. It is going to loosen up a lot of that buildup, right? And so what's going to happen is it's all going to loosen up, and it will mostly liquefy and pull it right through your valves. But if you have a heavy buildup in there, it's gonna break it up a little bit too, right? And it's gonna come right through the valves. It'll pull right through, but again, you don't want to have to do that if you're in there cleaning this up. You want to go in there and clean these. You don't have to go crazy, but just take some WD-40. I use. I put that, and you just spray it in there. Run your fingers through there. Take a shop rag and just kind of pull it through a few times. That'll get the chunky stuff out. You don't have to get it perfect, but again, you don't want that chunky stuff flying through your valves and then it gets hung up on a valve. Might not be a big deal because it'll probably liquefy eventually and pull right through, but you just don't want to have to do things like that unless you're not aware of it, or you have no choice and just run it, right? So that's my tip on that, is to get those clean. Put the gaskets on once it's clean on both sides. If you flip it over, it's the same deal, right? It's the gaskets, and I cleaned it up on both sides. So there's something I wanted to point out too. When it comes to cylinder heads, the intake ports on the heads, you don't really want those smooth. And if you looked at those would have some grit or some grain texture to them. And the reason why is because that helps to mix the air and the gas as it pulls through the intake ports, and then eventually makes its way into the cylinder combustion area, right? So on the intake, plastic, clean it up, get it nice and clean. Not crazy, but get it clean enough where it's fairly smooth. And then on the intake ports themselves, on the heads, don't touch those because you're gonna make a mess. And then second of all, you don't want those really smooth. You kind of want those to be a little more gritty or grainy, and that helps with the gas and the air to mix before it goes into the combustion chamber. So that is kind of the high level. Lower intake's going to go on next, and after that, I am gonna put the upper intake on. I went to put the lower manifold on, and what I noticed was that somebody had been in here in the past, whether it was a mechanic or a shop, and they broke one of the lower manifold bolts off. It is the one in the back closest to the firewall, and happens to be the one that is throwing the misfire code, cylinder 6 misfire code. So I think what usually happens is you bring your car for repair, and sometimes, or somebody breaks a bolt, and it's probably harmless not to have all 8 bolts on for missing one. However, if you have this situation in the back where that one bolt broke on you, you have a couple options. You can drill it out and tap it, or you can drill it out larger and put a bolt with a nut on it. So for me, it's a tough area to tap out, and the angle is really tough, even tougher, I'd say. So just to make this an easy process, the way the block is machined, that flange where that hole is, I already drilled that out. That flange is actually probably only 5/8 inch thick right there. And there's nothing behind it. I'm not going into the block area. There's just air behind it, right? So the whole design is that this flange sticks out, and there was a hole there, and there was a bolt going through there, right? That was threaded into that area. So I drilled it out, and I'm just going to use a high temperature bolt and a nut. This is a lock washer nut for exhaust, and this is a hardened steel bolt that you would find at Tractor Supply. It's a grade 5. I'm going to use that. I'm going to put that through it, put the nut underneath it, behind it, put the bolt through the manifold, and then just call it a day, right? So that's an option you can do. I believe this Jeep probably had about 70,000 or so miles on it with that bolt missing. And honestly, it probably didn't matter, but it could have been the source of some of the issues on cylinder 6. Let's see, right? But anyways, that's what I wanted to show. You can drill it out and you can tap it and get it, factory, or you can just drill it out and then put a nut and a bolt through there.